session.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Michel Fortier from the Canadian Light Source, and I'm honored to convene this session. Our next speaker is Professor Asmerat Berhe from the University of California at Merced. Asmerat has a Bachelor of Science degree in Soil and Water Conservation from the University of Asmara in Eritrea, and a master's degree in Political Ecology from Michigan State University. And then she did a PhD in Biogeochemistry at the University of California at Berkeley. And her research is focused on understanding the impact of environmental conditions on soil processes. And she has been involved in quite a few global initiatives like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that was commissioned by the United Nations. And she's also an advocate for women in science. Her talk is understanding the effect of changing environmental conditions on vital soil processes. So please go ahead and start.
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for the organizers for the invitation and the generous introduction. I realize this is quite a switch of topics for most attendees. But I'm really glad to be sharing my work in soil science with you all. As Michelle indicated, I work on soil science. I'm a soil scientist by training, and most of my work deals with biogeochemistry, meaning the cycling of essential elements between the soil, the atmosphere, and the hydrosphere. Today, I'll focus my talk on phosphorus dynamics in soil and in particular dust. And I'll tell you some stories from data that we've collected using ZANES. And I'll try to give you a brief introduction to the kind of work that I do, just so that we're all on the same page as we start. Before moving forward, I would like to acknowledge that I work as part of a very dynamic interdisciplinary team, including my current PhD student, Morgan Barnes, and collaborators that are listed on the slide, which all deserve credit for this presentation and the work that I'm going to be discussing. Okay, so generally speaking, the kind of work that we do in my lab deals with, as I mentioned, these biogeochemical cycles of essential elements, in particular carbon, but also nitrogen and phosphorus. And a lot of times we deal with also this Pi-C pool that I referred to on the screen, which is a pyrogenic carbon or fire-altered carbon that is a product of wildfires in the environment. And we spend a lot of time thinking about what happens to these essential processes that cycle the nutrients within the soil system and between the soil and the other spheres when there is sudden rapid change in environmental conditions. It seems like somebody's having connection issues in the chat. Hopefully, I'll try to slow down. Hopefully that will work. So we try to study what happens to these essential processes when there is sudden change in environmental conditions, in particular things that happen during erosion, when erosion laterally redistributes topsoil in the earth system, when fire causes combustion of biomass and deposition of these fire-altered carbon as a partial product of combustion of biomass, as well as, as a product of different global change variables that have to do with changing atmospheric temperature or changing the amount, distribution, and pattern of precipitation globally. Because all of these things introduce a very sudden change in environmental conditions that produce the soil and that govern the cycling of these essential elements. So we've concerned ourselves a lot about the vertical and lateral transport of topsoil and associated organic matter within the soil system, as well as export of topsoil material from terrestrial to aquatic systems. We spend a lot of time thinking about how natural nanoparticulate minerals, in particular metal oxides of iron, aluminum oxides, and hydroxides and oxyhydroxides, how they stabilize organic matter in soil, make it less available for microbial processing and decomposition, and how they govern key soil processes, how those interactions govern key soil processes. And then at the larger scale, we think a lot about about the role that soil plays in human society, in particular, this resource, the soil system that humanity as a whole refers to, we depend on the soil system for roughly about 97% of all the food that we eat. At the same time, we derive a lot of our needs for feed, fiber, and a bunch of other things also on soil. But this resource base that we need for humanity to survive and thrive is currently compromised in a major way because of human actions. So we've spent a lot of time thinking about what does this mean for the fate of humanity going forward, in particular for national security type of considerations. And with all the work that we do in our lab that spans multiple spatial and temporal scales, multiple traditional chemistry approaches, kind of association biochemistry type of work, as well as more introduction of advanced spectroscopy to be used with soils. We've tried to practice principles of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion to make sure that everybody gets represented in the kind of work that we do and is welcome to do this kind of work in academic institutions. Okay. And I'll structure my talk in a way that I'll talk about phosphorus speciation in soil in particular in the first section, and then I'll talk about phosphorus in dust, and end with some concluding thoughts. Okay, so to start with, I'm concerning myself with phosphorus in particular because it is one of the very essential and major macronutrients in soil, meaning it's needed in large quantities for plants to complete their physiological cycles. It's a critical element needed for a range of cellular and genetic processes, key for energy transfer processes in biological organisms, as well as structural support for plants. So essentially what it means is that if plants do not have access to enough available phosphorus, they cannot complete their physiological cycles, they cannot produce the food that we want them to, and photosynthesis and a range of associated processes will be hampered. But the biogeochemical cycle of phosphorus is one of the most complex that we know of. For plants to be able to use phosphorus, first it needs to be available in the form of phosphates in soil solution. But there's a lot of competition for that phosphate in the soil that could enter into soil solution because to start with, the primary source of phosphorus is only phosphorus-bearing rock minerals, in particular this mineral called apatite. And this mineral has to weather, it has to undergo both physical breakdown of the rock into smaller pieces and associated biological, chemical, and geological processes in the soil system, which we collectively refer to as biogeochemical transformations. Oh, I have audio interference from somebody. Okay, perfect. So these. I don't know if you all can hear.
Berhe, I'm going to take a moment to mute everyone, and then you should unmute yourself again. Simply, I can't find the person easily.
Okay, no worries.
And so now you can unmute yourself only, Dr. Berhe. I have unmuted everyone.
Okay. Let me go back to this slide. Okay, can you hear me now?
I can certainly hear you. I'm going to mute myself now. No, I cannot hear you now. I'm unmuting you again. Ask to unmute. So I have asked you to unmute yourself electronically, and now I'm
I've done so.
And now I can hear you, and sorry for the interruption.
No worries, thank you, I appreciate that. So as I was saying, this biogeochemical cycling of phosphorus is a pretty complex process. There's a lot of competition for phosphorus once it enters into soil, because as it's undergoing biogeochemical transformations, first of all, plants can take it up, but also microbes can take it up in soil. But it could also be immobilized by sorption onto reactive mineral surfaces, in particular clay minerals, iron aluminum oxides, carbonates associated with calcium in particular, and others. And this sorption with the minerals makes it unavailable for plants. And so there's a lot of emphasis on phosphorus being available when you think about the phosphorus cycle, because a bulk of the phosphorus that exists in soil, typically 90–95% of the phosphorus, is not available for plants. Plants cannot basically desorb phosphorus outside long-term weathering processes that take a lot of energy. And so it becomes a key nutrient that controls plant productivity, a key nutrient that controls a range of biological processes in soil. And also important to note that the biogeochemical cycle the biogeochemical cycle of phosphorus is also complex, but because phosphorus only originates from this phosphorus-bearing parent material or rock as a product of weathering, but it also has no mechanism for biological fixation. What we're talking about here is basically that, unlike nitrogen, that microbes can form association with plants and soil to fix it from atmospheric nitrogen, for example, there's no atmospheric component in the phosphorus cycle, and there's no potential to biologically fix it. So it becomes an even more challenging nutrient that limits plant productivity. And this limit to plant productivity is also propagated into limits on the amount of carbon that plants and then the soil system can take out from the atmosphere. Keep in mind that the amount of carbon dioxide that's currently in the atmosphere that we're all worried about from a climate change perspective is mostly a product of fossil fuel derived carbon that was released to the atmosphere, but some of it is also derived from deforestation and land use patterns. And so it's carbon that was released from soil back into the atmosphere. But we also know that we could do the reverse. We can entice, if you will, or kind of help the soil system take up extra carbon dioxide from the atmosphere so that it reduces the atmospheric burden of CO2. But for that to happen, plants need to photosynthesize at their optimal rates. And then once those plants or the animals that consume the plants die, their biomass has to enter the soil, which is a beneficial thing for many, many, many reasons. But what you see in the charts that are on the right side of the screen is that the ability of plants to photosynthesize, as represented by NPP, or net primary productivity, in the top panel, and the ability of the terrestrial ecosystem or land to take up atmospheric carbon dioxide is increasingly constrained by phosphorus. So what you're seeing in the figure here is model projections of terrestrial plant productivity and carbon storage, where the black line represents how much plant productivity could happen in the top panel, or how much carbon uptake from the atmosphere to the soil, or net removal of atmospheric CO2 that can happen by land if there was no nutrient limitations. But the red box shows what would happen if we considered the fact that large parts of the terrestrial ecosystem is actually faces nutrient limitation, in particular for nitrogen. And the blue line highlights what happens when you consider the real challenges that most ecosystems have to face with phosphorus and nitrogen limitation for plant productivity. In case this did not become clear from my discussion, this is part of the reason why farmers around the world spend a lot of time thinking about fertilization to supplement plant productivity, because nitrogen and phosphorus are limiting plant productivity, and plants cannot grow optimally without those. So they spend a lot of time trying to find ways to supplement nitrogen and phosphorus to alleviate the nutrient limitations soils are facing. And this nutrient limitation then shows up in even our ability to mitigate against climate change, because doing so requires that we overcome this nutrient limitations, but we still have a lot of challenge in understanding, in particular, the phosphorus cycle. As I mentioned, phosphorus is this complex nutrient that's distributed in multiple different pools in soil, as you saw from that flowchart-based phosphorus cycle before. And traditionally speaking, most people in the soil science, agronomy, and other communities that think about phosphorus availability in soil, sediment, or dust used to use this wet chemistry approach that's called Hadley fractionation scheme. It's a successive, extraction scheme that uses different chemicals to extract phosphorus that's associated with different pools in soil. In particular, trying to identify phosphorus that is somewhat available to plants versus phosphorus that's actually locked away in mineral associations and is not available to plants. But part of the problem that we've had historically in our scientific community is that this successive fractionation scheme that I described, that's on the right in this figure, is actually not a very accurate way to represent how phosphorus exists in soil. You can have multiple pools associated with different types of minerals get extracted in different steps. And so the picture had remained very muddied, if I may, to basically cause major issues with misquantification of phosphorus availability in soil that has hampered advances in our understanding of the phosphorus cycle until now. But recent advances in adoption of X-ray spectroscopy, though, has allowed us to basically, we've spent a lot of time, and I have to give special credit here to my student, Morgan Barnes, and my collaborator, Mike Zhu, who've spent a lot of time in synchrotron facilities trying to develop very good reference spectra for phosphorus zanes, which they have to do by characterizing different types of phosphorus that they can find and imagine independently, as well as once the phosphorus is absorbed to mineral surfaces, both considering the organic and inorganic forms that phosphorus might exist in soil. And once they've developed the robust reference libraries, then we're now able to use kind of that information to quantify distribution of phosphorus more accurately in soil, in pools that are associated with iron, aluminum, calcium, which are unavailable, versus organic pools of phosphorus, and some phosphates that are more available to plants. And this technique, obviously, it takes a lot of time. It has taken a lot of energy, but it has allowed us to develop a better understanding of the phosphorus cycle using in situ non-destructive approaches that require, relatively speaking, minimal sample treatments. And the work that I'm going to talk about today was all conducted at either the Canadian Light Source or Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. Okay, so the first data I wanted to show you is on phosphorus speciation in soil, and trying to understand how phosphorus forms vary in soil along climatic gradients, in particular climatic gradients that constrain soil weathering intensity, or how processed the soil is, how different the soil is from the original parent rock that it was derived from, which is a function of climate, biological input, and a few other key environmental processes. So what you see in the chart on your right is this metric that we call EEMT, is just measuring energy input into soil as a way of the kind of quantifying the extent of weathering a given soil has seen. Each one of the dots and each one of the symbols represent different sites that we sampled along two major observatories and climate sequences, or soils that vary in terms of the impact climate has had on their development, on two sides of the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. and these are called the Southern Sierra CZO and the White Mountain, which I'm going to skip. But the main thing I wanted to highlight is the fact that there's huge variability in climate occurring between these sites that allow us to think about how phosphorus might be speciation might change, with climate, with weathering, and what kind of information we can get. And we've been fortunate to get this really wonderful data set that we're compiling on soils, on topsoils that is marked by A. It's how soil scientists describe topsoil. It's an A horizon. And then a B horizon is the layer that's right below it. And the C horizon is typically weathered rock that is not yet kind of the loose soil material that you recognize on the soil surface. And so we've been able, without going into too much detail, we've been able to see that as a function of weathering, as this EMT variable that I mentioned increases, we've been able to see shifts from calcium to all more iron and aluminum-based associations for phosphorus. And we've been able to kind of accurately quantify how phosphorus forms vary with climate, how phosphorus forms vary with climate, and depth and weathering intensities in ways that we've never really been able to do with soils until recently. And this is now allowing us to rethink a traditional model that has been basically the way that soil science has viewed and understood phosphorus cycling historically, where as a function of pedogenesis, which is basically time since weathering started and how altered the soil is, the distribution of phosphorus was assumed to follow this kind of model that you see here. But the data that we've been able to get with Zanes is now allowing us to rethink that model. And we're able to see that, first of all, phosphorus amount doesn't follow this traditional model, now that we're able to verify the different forms of phosphorus using Zanes. And there's even important differences that we're seeing with depth, but we are seeing maybe slightly similar patterns to the traditional model when it comes to speciation and distribution of phosphorus. In particular, that shift from calcium associated phosphorus, which is common form in the rock that bears phosphorus, to more as weathering intensifies in the soil, accumulate iron, aluminum oxyhydroxides, oxides, and things like that, that phosphorus starts more and more to be associated with them. And we're also seeing that the organic form in phosphorus is relatively affected little with weathering intensity. These are kind of shifting the paradigm of phosphorus cycling, if you will, in soil science, which has been great. And it's part of the PhD thesis of my student, Morgan Barnes, that I mentioned, who's getting ready to defend her dissertation in a couple of weeks. The next piece of work that is related to this is what happens when wind blows soil from the soil surface and transports it. And this is a really important mechanism that controls soil health, even environmental health and air quality in many parts of the world, because in particular in dry ecosystems, wind is able to lift a lot of dust, meaning pick up soil from the ground and transport it and keep it suspended in air for long periods of time. And we even know that dust is transported long distances globally, thanks to a lot of exciting work that's been happening in this field recently. This is, for example, a major variable in Africa, because the dust transported from Sahara has now been traced in many parts of the world, with very interesting implications for biogeochemical cycles of essential elements, including phosphorus. One of the things important things we're learning as we gain more and more understanding of dust transport and dynamics is that dust can outpace the supply of bedrock nutrients into soils in terms of available phosphorus, at least in the short term, at least in systems that don't have a lot of phosphorus in their bedrock, or are the way the soils are not weathering extensively very fast. And this is interesting and important because I told you early on that phosphorus availability limits plant productivity, the ability of soils to sequester atmospheric carbon and things like that. But we know that phosphorus cycling in soil is a very slow process that's governed, more by geologic timescales than human timescales. But dust transport is a rapid process, right? It could lift sediments from one part of the world and deposit them somewhere else a few weeks, if not, later. And that supply of phosphorus that's happening by dust in some ecosystems seems to be bigger in the short term than what weathering of rock can provide to the soil system. And we've also seen evidence that plants can pick up this dust transported phosphorus and use it quite readily. So this motivated a work that was funded by the US Department of Energy to allow us to monitor two ecosystems, one in more the central part of the US in Colorado, and another one in the western part of the US in California, two major mountain ecosystems, the Rocky Mountain and then the Sierra Nevada in California. And we were able to collect dust, painstakingly collect dust for long periods of time so that we can establish where the dust is coming from. So where was this soil before it was transported to the Colorado and California, and then be able to characterize it. There's a lot of interesting challenges, scientific challenges that arise with this, because to be able to accurately, first of all, identify where the dust is coming from, you need to collect enough material. And imagine needing to collect enough material to do all kinds of chemistry and physical characterization just from dust. It takes a lot of time, a lot of energy and patience. But once you do that, thankfully, we have tracer approaches, in particular lead isotope-based approaches that can relatively accurately pinpoint where that material was originally weathered in. So where was that soil before it was lifted up by wind is basically what we're talking about. And without boring you in the details, which are characterized in a paper we published this year in Environmental Science and Technology, we see interesting differences where, for example, in Colorado, in the central part of the US, in the Rocky Mountains, about 55% or so of the dust is actually derived from Asia, in particular in relatively wet winter and spring seasons. But in the dry seasons, somewhat, maximum 37%, but it could even be zero at different seasons, is derived from Asian source. But Asian source seem to be the dominant sources of dust. In California, we investigated dust collected from high and low elevation across the Sierra Nevada as a very steep high elevation system. So when you are in the low elevation system, about 400 or so meters above sea level, there's somewhere between 14 to 22% of the dust is derived from Asia. But in high elevation systems, in particular in drier systems of late summer and fall, 12 to 38% of this dust is sourced from Asia. What this says is that in California, a relatively drier system that's also agricultural region of the country, there's a relatively large proportion of, in particular, local dust derived from the Central Valley of California, especially at low elevation systems. But at high elevation, you have more Asian derived dust. Okay, and we were again able to apply ZANES to speciate the dust samples that we collected across many of these ecosystems, and done that repeatedly with different types of approaches to verify what we're looking at, because this is kind of one of the very few times that this kind of work has been done. And we find is like very surprising results that we didn't expect, that the dust brought with it a lot of organic phosphorus, that could potentially provide plant available phosphorus when it's deposited in soil. And this is important. Remember, this is why dust is outpacing the soil weathering and rock input that I mentioned earlier, because the dust derived phosphorus, in particular the dust that is in higher elevation systems, seems considerably more enriched in organic species that are more available and that are likely to make huge significant differences for the soil productivity and the plant productivity in the short term. Long story that I told you in a lot of details, but the bottom line is that I hope I've convinced you that using Zanes along with traditional soil science and geochemistry approaches has been really beneficial in transforming work in the field of phosphorus biogeochemistry. And we are now able to get more accurate representation of what exactly is the phosphorus that's extracted with the different sequential fractionation schemes, and get an accurate representation of the different pools of phosphorus in soil and dust, and how phosphorus nature and speciation evolves with soil weathering over time. And we're also now able to see that dust inputs are significant sources of plant available nutrients, in particular in kind of temperate ecosystems that we studied. But we've also seen interesting differences in the source of the dust seasonally, where, remember, as I mentioned, in lower elevation systems in California in particular, at dry seasons, the big bulk of the input is coming from local sources, but in high elevation systems, in particular in wetter seasons, it's mostly Asian derived long range transported dust that's arriving in these ecosystems. And we've also seen the interesting and unexpected result that organic phosphate species dominate dust or particulate matter samples collected both at Florida and Colorado and California. And I think with that, I'll end. I'll just say that this work would not be possible without the generous support, both the financial resources as well as access to the instrumentation we received, again, from the Canadian Light Source, SLAC at Stanford, and the Environmental Molecular Science Lab at the Pacific Northwest National Lab in the state of Washington, and of course, many collaborators. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if we have any questions. I didn't see any in the chat, but okay, I see there is one question from Masood. So it says, using Zanes was a good idea for tracing. Do you think XAFs for the structural behavior around P atom? Did you think
there's some colleagues that are trying these approaches. So one thing I should have said probably is the fact that what makes using soil as a media for this kind of work very, very challenging is because soil has mixture of, say, for example, if you focus on phosphorus, derived from many different sources over different time periods, and the concentrations are relatively not high. So any kind of adoption of these techniques has to go through a very protracted time period of trying to get these techniques to work with soil. So there's relatively few published works out there with XAF, only because they're still in development stages, but the possibility seems to be real.
Additional questions in the chat. And in the interest of time, I will just move on to the next talk, but I think you can interact with the questions in the chat. Yeah.
I will stop sharing my screen, and I will respond to the chat questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.